Good evening, everybody, or whatever time of day you happen to be looking at this. It's a lovely evening here in this beautiful song school, and I've just got an audience of two people, Michael and Lee, so I've asked them to pretend to be many and join in the songs, but looks of horror came over their faces, so maybe they won't. Thank you very much for having me. What I'm intending to do this evening is to give you an overview of traditional song and put some contextual background in as to how Scott fitted into that. And I'm going to be illustrating it with maybe 6 or 8 songs which are either directly or indirectly connected to Scott. Avoiding where possible the Gutenberg collection, because I understand that most of you have been given a copy of the CD and you'll therefore be familiar with those songs, so we don't want to double up. And normally, with a sea of faces, I would be using bullet points and interacting with my audience. In the absence of one, apart from 2 people, I will be relying on my notes, which will keep me on track, stop me going off-piste, as it were, too much, and leave more time for the songs. So excuse me if I keep putting my glasses on and off. So, traditional songs. They were mainly of the people and for the people, hence the word folk. And they were mainly, but not exclusively, passed down the generations via the oral tradition. There are almost as many versions of any given song as there are people who've sung them, as each have their own interpretation, and over time they change. Sometimes this is organic, and sometimes it's deliberate, as characters and place names are changed to suit the locality or situation. However, it would be erroneous to imagine that these songs have sprung out of the ether with no authorship at all, whereas in the oral tradition and with songs of great antiquity, it would be impossible to determine who'd first written them. There are many instances where we do know who wrote them. And often there are many instances where they come from quite well-known writers from fairly high-ranking families. And they're often manuscript versions of them. And then when we get to the 16th century, we begin to find printed things. The printed songs were mainly in the form of broadsides or broadsheets, so called because they were printed on a single sheet of broad paper, very thin, cheap paper, which was sold for about a penny. These were like the precursors of newspapers. They weren't just songs that were printed on them. They had some rather intricate woodcuts as well. And you would get things like the local gossip or even the national gossip, and particularly scandal they were used for. But a lot of them had songs on them. And this was how people used to distribute them, because you could buy them for a penny each. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, these were very popular and they gradually died out then. But ballads have retained their popularity partly because so many famous people were collectors of ballads. Samuel Pepys was one, and another one was Robert Harley, the first Earl of Oxford and Mortimer, whose collection is now referred to as the Roxburgh collection, although it has very little to do with Roxburgh. It's got that name because the Baron who became the first Earl of Roxburgh managed to acquire the collection, and that's the only connection it has with Roxburgh itself. The songs appear all over the world. Versions of the same songs appear all over the world. And I'm not just referring to the many that went over to the Americas from Britain and Ireland with the emigrants. All over Europe, songs appear in different languages, but they're exactly the same songs, and we assume that these were distributed by sailors at some time. They vary in their subjects hugely. You could say that all human life is there. But featuring very heavily are 3 in particular subjects. One is romantic love, one is sex, and one is death. There's a fairly high death count in quite a lot of folk songs, and also the supernatural, of course, in which Scott was very interested. They do say that if there isn't a fairly high death count or the song isn't particularly miserable, then it can't possibly be a folk song, which of course is utter rubbish, because in my normal repertoire there are quite a large number of songs, quite a high proportion of quite quite happy songs, quite cheerful ones. They just don't seem to have a great deal to do with Scott. So for the last fortnight, since Michael gave me the date for this recording, I've been desperately trying to learn some of Scott's songs. Many of them tell stories of actual events, and whether they relate to actual events or not, many of them tell a story, as do ballads, but not all story songs are ballads. Ballads developed from minstrelsy in the 14th and 15th centuries and are formulaic in type, structure and imagery. This was to enable the minstrels, once they'd left the court, when troubadours came in instead of minstrels, they became wandering minstrels, and they needed to remember these songs and stories wherever they travelled. So there was a formula which helped them to do this, as some of them are very long indeed. Some would say interminably long. And if you visit a folk club when they're having a sing-around, there's always one, usually the one with the least good voice, who will subject everyone else to an interminably long, sort of 39-verse ballad, thereby taking everybody else's turns as well as theirs. However, I digress. There's one ballad which is extremely short, a Scottish one. It's called The Burning of Auchindoun. And it very elegantly tells the whole story in 2 short verses, but they're few and far between. They're normally quite long. They're generally in the third person, often beginning in the middle with hidden, concealed information, as it were. They often have a refrain rather than a chorus, as do other songs. And they often have repeating lines in each verse. 4-line stanzas in ABCB format equates to the standard ballad metre, but they do vary a lot. There are also 4- and 8-line couplets where B and D rhyme, but the story is carried on A and C. And I will actually sing one of those for you, see if you can pick it out if I forget to mention it. The imagery are things like looking over the left shoulder. That normally equates to submission. And then there's hair combing, which equals erotic longing. There are also floating verses, and this applies to all sorts of traditional song, not just ballads. They're not always even complete verses. Sometimes they can be floating lines or floating phrases. And you find them all over the place in songs that have no relation to each other whatsoever. Lots and lots of different subjects. But these same verses turn up all over the place. Earlier in the 18th century, Bishop Thomas Percy had compiled his Relics of English Poetry. Alan Ramsay, the father of the artist, had collected some of Scotland's earlier poetry in the Evergreen, and he also compiled the Tea Table Miscellany, which we do know was known to Scott. Joseph Ritson in northern England, who was an antiquary and vegetarian, was gathering his Robin Hood ballad collection at this time, and the Brothers Grimm were collecting folk stories also. It isn't actually that widely known, except to this erudite audience, that Scott was a collector of songs as well as artefacts. In the 4-year degree course that I did at Newcastle, where we studied a lot of Scottish collectors, there was never any mention of Scott, despite the fact that the minstrelsy launched his writing career. Now, it's at this point I'm going to introduce the first 2 songs. The first one was actually written by Scott from a tiny fragment that he found, which was called John of Hazel Green. And he built up a rather lovely song, a romantic song out of that. And we might as well start with one that ends well for the heroine, because it's going to go downhill pretty rapidly from here on in when it comes to the cheerful stakes. So this is, of course, Jock of Hazeldene. Why weep ye by the tide, lady? Why weep ye by the tide? I'll wed ye to my youngest son, and ye shall be his bride, and ye shall be his bride, lady, sae comely tae be seen. she let the tears down fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. Now let this wilful grief be done, and dry that cheek sae pale. Young Frank is chief of Errington, and lord of Langley-Dale. His step is first in cheerful hall, his sword in battle keen. But she let the tears down fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. A chain of gold ye shall not lack, nor braid to bind your hair, a mettled hound, nor managed hawk, or palfrey fresh and fair. But ye, the foremost of them all, shall ride our forest queen. But she let the tears down fall for Jock o' Hazeldean. The kirk was decked by morning tide, and tapers glimmered fair. The priest and bridegroom wait the bride, and dame and knight were there. They sought her both by bar and hall, the lady was nae seen, for she's o'er the border and awa' with Jock o' Hazeldean. She's o'er the border and awa' with Jock o' Hazeldean. Now the next one is totally different from that. It's another one from the minstrelsy, which Jock o' Hazeldean is as well. And this is a song that has lots and lots of versions, many of them English, sometimes called the Three Ravens, sometimes the Two Ravens, but it's definitely a song that originated in Scotland. And it's in dialect, so I'm going to sing it as it was written because I don't see the point in anglicising things for the sake of it. And it's slightly macabre. It's a couple of carrion discussing where their next dinner's coming from. So it's the Twa Corbies. As I was walking all alane, I heard Twa Corbies mucking main, and ane to the other it say, oh, wha shall we gang and dine the day, oh, wha shall we gang and dine the day? Oh, in a hinge on Oldfale Dyke, I wot there lies a new slain knight, and naebody kens that he lies there, oh, but his hawk and his hound and his lady fair, oh, his hawk and his hound and his lady fair. His hawk is tae the hunting gone, his hound will fetch the wildfowl home, his lady's ta'en and it for mate, oh, so we might get to dinner's wait, oh, we might get to dinner's wait. Ye'll sit on his white horse bane, and I'll pike out his bonny blue een, and we'll log his golden hair, oh, we'll feek our nest where it lies bare, oh, we'll feek our nest where it lies bare. There's money earning for him makes main, but none shall ken where he is gain. And o'er his white bones when they are bare, oh, the wind shall blow forevermore, oh, the wind shall blow forevermore. Scott first came across traditional songs as a young child when he was sent from Edinburgh to stay with relatives in the Borders because of illness, which of course you will all know about. He had 2 extended stays in the Borders, although the one in his teens was slightly shorter, well, considerably shorter. But as a very small child, he had quite a long time from being a toddler. And his imagination was caught by the supernatural and revenants or undead, which were featured in songs of the oral tradition, which was very strong in the borders at the time he was there. His relatives had people come round and they would have ceilidhs, which people don't seem to realise are actually gatherings. They're not dancers, although the term tends to mean a dance these days. His interest was particularly in ballads. And after he'd qualified as a lawyer, he began to return frequently to the borders with one Robert Shortreed on what they called raids in order to collect the ballads that he'd first heard as a child. In 1802, he collated his minstrelsy of the Scottish border, which is something of a misnomer because it's a compendium of songs from around the whole of Scotland, with at least one from England, a lot of which were from manuscripts sent to him by other people. It was a result of a collaboration with other scholars, including Ritson, who we mentioned, Richard Heber, Bishop Percy again, George Ellis, Robert Surtees, and Robert Jimison. He also employed a poor student, John Leyden, to help with the fieldwork. And in fact, he did relatively little fieldwork himself specifically for the collection, except for several visits to John Eliot of Cleuchhead, where he heard the Fray of Support by Jonathan Graham, and to James Hoggs, to hear his mother, Margaret Maitland, sing Old Maitland, although he had previously collected songs from Margaret Maitland. His copious accompanying notes on each item bear this out. Like others before and since, Scott was not alone in believing that songs needed to be heavily mediated at times. This was done by collectors who believed that songs needed to be either improved or sanitized for consumption by polite society, or to make more sense, or to scan better. Various versions were often combined or added to, or vice versa, by collectors. And ironically, this was in search of authenticity. Ritson, who's one of the few collectors who didn't employ this practice, was highly critical of Bishop Percy, who was of the same opinion as Scott, that they had to be corrected. Ritson said that there was no such thing as a standard ballad with corruptions. And of course, he was absolutely right. But unlike some, Scott always made it perfectly clear when and where he had altered things. And also, his irreverence in contorting them to his own ends is only what ballad singers do anyway, changing all the details, bar the storyline. People, dates, words, locale, all sorts of things are changed the world over by singers. And sometimes the same singer will change a song wherever they happen to be singing to suit a locale. A good example of changes can be seen in Young Lochinvar from A Garland of New Songs. I've just realised I forgot to say something. With regard to broadsheets, this broadsheet of paper, if it was cut in half down that way, it was called a broad slip. And if it was folded up with a song on it, it was called a chapbook. If it had more than one song on it, this folded piece was called a garland. And that's why we have A Garland of New Songs. So this Young Lochinvar was from A Garland of New Songs, which were a ballad collection put together by John Bell of Newcastle between 1810 and 1828. It's from the Song of Lochinvar in the 5th canto of Marmion, which is itself based on an old ballad called Catherine Jaffrey, and Scott's version of which was collected from traditional singers, and that is also in the minstrelsy. The Lay of the Last Minstrel, Scott's first poem, was an imitation ballad and had been intended for inclusion in the minstrelsy, but it just grew too long. Scott was also very much indebted to Willie Laidlaw, James Hogg, the Ettrick shepherd, and his mother, Margaret Maitland, and to Anna Gordon of Aberdeen, in addition to many old manuscripts. He believed that it was necessary to print these in order to preserve them, but that was controversial. And Margaret Maitland told him in no uncertain terms what she thought about songs being for singing and not for reading. And she said he'd also written them all down wrong as well. So the collection includes 96 songs and poems, plus elaborations on the background to narratives and extended essays on history and fairy tradition, along with the modus operandi of contemporary authors who contributed ballad imitations. It's highly debatable whether or not Scott's songs would have been lost had he not recorded them, because despite rumours to the contrary, the oral tradition is still alive and well even now, and also there were other sources of many of the songs which Scott put together. However, if he saved even one or two, it was worth it. Now, at this point I'm going to sing two more songs. They are both songs on the same subject. They're totally different, as you will discover. The subject being the doing away with, by various means, in this case drowning, of a lover by a girl's father, brothers, uncles, usually some male member of her family, probably because they either didn't approve of the person himself or they wanted an arranged marriage for land or money purposes. This seemed to happen quite a lot. Now, the first one is one of lots and lots of versions. In the Child collection, he has songs number 214 and 215, both called The Braes of Yarrow. He clearly considered them totally different songs, otherwise they wouldn't have been two different numbers. What's even more confusing is the fact they each have variations that are called the Dowie Dens of Yarrow. Now, on the Gutenberg CD, which most of you have, I'm fully aware that there is the Dowie Dens of Yarrow. However, what I'm going to sing is totally different from that. This one is child number 215, of which there are 8 A to H listed, and this is the first one, and it's called Rare Willie Drowns in Yarrow. So here we have it. Oh, just before I start, most of the other variants of this particular one are from the north of Scotland, and they're called the Water of Gamry or the Water of Gemry, varying shades of that word, and that's on the Moray Firth. And in those particular versions, the man is not murdered, he accidentally drowns on his way to the wedding. But all the ones from the borders and anything else I've seen is always, even if it's not clear, as it isn't in this particular version, it's always that he's been murdered. So this is Rare Willie Drowned in Yarrow. Oh, Willie's rare and Willie's fair, and Willie's wondrous bonny, and Willie says he'll marry me, ginna he'll marry Annie. Oh, come ye by yon waterside, pulled ye the rose or lily? Or come ye by yon meadows green, or saw ye my sweet Willie? She sought him east, she sought him west, she sought him broad and narrow, till in the clifting or crag she found him drowned in Yarrow. His hair it was 3/4 long, 3/4 long and yellow. She tied it round her middle small and drew him out o' Yarrow. Yestreen I made my bed full broad, tonight I'll mark it narrow, and all the livelong winter's night I lie twinned o' my marrow. I Willie's rare and Willie's fair, and Willie's wondrous bonny, and Willie said he'd marry me, ginna he'd marry Annie. The next one is, as I said, on the same subject. It was a very, very different song. It's far more graphic. There's absolutely no doubt that he was murdered in this one. There are lots of versions of this, and the one I'm going to sing is the same one that Malinky do, and this comes from Alison McMorland, from a Mrs. Arnott of Aberbrothick, which is Arbroath. In the 18th century, it was collected by Robert Jimison, who we've already mentioned was one of the collaborators on the minstrelsy. However, I don't think it's this version that's in the minstrelsy. I think it's the one that he collected from Margaret Maitland, and I really should have checked that before this evening, and I didn't. So this is Clerk Saunders. Clerk Saunders and May Margaret were walking on yon gravelled green. Sad and heavy was the love, I wot it fell this 'twar between. A bed, Clerk Saunders said, a bed for you and me. Oh no, the lady cried, until the day we married be. For in would come my 7 brothers, with all their torches burning bright. They'd say, we have pity in sister, and here she's lying with you this night. You'll take the sword from my scabbard, and luly lift the gin. And you will swear a solemn oath, you never let Clerk Saunders in. You'll tuck me in your arms twa, you'll carry me ben and tae your bed, and ye must swear a solemn oath, across your bar I now did tread. They were nae long and tae the room, they were nae long and tae the bed, when in there came their 7 brothers, with all their torches burning red. Out then spak the first brother, it's lang since this love began. Out then spak the second brother, it's a sin to kill the sleeping man. Out then spak the third brother, we'd better gang and let them be. Out then spak the neist of them, you'll no be killed this night for me. Out then spak the 5th brother, aye, and an angry man was he. I bear the sword in my right hand, that will gar Clerk Saunders dee. He's ta'en out his long sword, that he had struck it through the stray, and through Clerk Saunders' body, I wot he has scarred iron grey. Awake, Clerk Saunders, she says, awake, for sin and shame. The day is bright, the sun shines light, and I'm afraid we will be ta'en. Aye, she walkened this dead man, aye, she rocked him to and fro. Aye, she welcomed this dead man, for of his death she didn't yet know. I'll do as much for ye, Clerk Saunders, whatever ladies would nae tho, till 7 long years have passed and gone, there's nae a shoe gaze on my soul. There'll ne'er be a sock upon my back, there'll ne'er be a cane strake through my hair, there'll ne'er be coal nor candle light shine in my bar nae mair. It's another cheery little number. Scott's eldest daughter Sophie sang the songs that he collected, and she also learned some Gaelic from the MacLeods of Dunvegan. who they visited in 1814. And there's one particular Gaelic song that we know that she sung to her father because he wrote to the MacLeods thanking them for it. There are several reasons why I'm not going to sing that song, not least of which because I couldn't learn it in time. I do have a little Gaelic, but not enough to learn the song quickly from scratch because I need it in writing and I need to see it and hear it at the same time and put them together. So I'm going to sing you another song. This is the only real cheat in the entire evening because it may or may not have been one that Scott heard. But it's an old song sung to a lovely Scottish air, a lovely Gaelic air. And it's called Sheena Bhan, which means fair Jean. And it's a love song, but don't get too excited because it's got a very sad tinge in that the man is just about to go off to war and he's not sure whether he will ever come back to her or not. So this is Sheena Bhan, and I'm putting my glasses on because I might just need to read a little bit of it. I'm going to start with the chorus, and then I'll miss it out between the first two verses. So as I'm starting with it, gentlemen, you'll learn it ever so quickly and join in the next time, won't you? Blan and kain Sheena Bhan, Railnan ni Angeles og, Gus bergjövar idom han, Gram och ri and riving og, Arosona vagin ja, Arivoni nishvo, Skulla sonnes oinja bal, Marone skull nem förvjan kjå. Bruen kogi ansen cheer, Faika longa tokajol, Kluainen drummes froimna pip, Vaikna swan edol ebod. Blanen kain Sheena Bhan, Railnan ni Angeles og, Gus bergjöva idom ran, Gram och ri an rivin jog. Maharandan mi vislan, Stadiranan gunan mo, Ambalyamoni mi vitav, the Sheena Bhan morivin jog. Blanen kain Sheena Bhan, Railnan ni Angeles og, Gus bergjöva idom ran, the Sheena Bhan morivin jog. So that's the Gaelic over for this evening. The next one is very much to do with the MacLeods of Dunvegan. When they went in 1814, Scott heard the last of the minstrels, which is quite interesting. I didn't realise that the last of the minstrels was apparently connected to the MacLeod's house. What I did know was that their hereditary pipers were the MacCrimmons. And while Scott was there, he also heard the then current MacCrimmon hereditary piper. And he heard the story of his relative, his ancestor, who had been killed during the 45. He was actually killed in 46. But he went along as piper with the chief, Norman MacLeod of MacLeod, on the side of the Hanoverians. And when he was taken at Inverurie, The Jacobite pipers went on strike because he was so well known and respected as a piper. The other side's pipers went on strike at his detention, which I thought was a rather lovely story. And when Scott heard this, and he heard that McCrimmon had written a lament because he'd had a foreboding about his own death, he actually wrote the words to this song. So it's called McCrimmon's Lament. Round Colin's Peak the mist is sailing, the banshee croons a note of wailing, but my blue ween with sorrow streaming for him who will never return, McCrimmon. No more, no more, no more, McCrimmon, in war or in peace, we return, McCrimmon. No more, no more, no more forever can love nor gold bring back McCrimmon. The breeze on the braes is mournfully moaning, the brook in the hollow is plaintively mourning, but my blue ween with sorrow streaming for him who will never return, McCrimmon. No more, no more, no more, McCrimmon, in war or in peace, shall return, McCrimmon. No more, no more, no more forever can love nor gold bring back McCrimmon. Despite his rather highbrow image subsequently, Scott's roots were in storytelling and popular culture, and his collection of around 2,500 chapbooks, stall tracts and pamphlets is arguably the finest in the world. It's currently being edited by the people at Gutenberg University, along with, in collaboration with the School of Scottish Studies. And I'm now going to read a piece by a former advocates librarian, just to give you a bit more contextual background. I say read a piece, I've almost been reading my notes, which I was trying not to do. So this was written by Alistair Johnson. His interest in topics such as topical ballads, witchcraft and the supernatural lay in an intellectual tradition where the divide between high and low popular culture was less clear than in other countries. Owing to the Reformation of the late 16th century and the removal of the Scottish royal family to London in 1603, plus the civil wars of the 17th century, Scotland's tradition of high art culture weakened, allowing popular culture to thrive in the void. When high art culture began to revive in the 18th century, Scotland found itself cut off from the courtly Renaissance culture of the 16th century. Writers, artists, and musicians instead turned to folk traditions for inspiration, often attempting to elevate it by introducing forms and sentiments associated with high art. Alan Ramsay, father of the painter, Robert Ferguson, James Boswell, James Macpherson, he of the Ossian hoax, Burns, Byron and Hogg all created a synthesis in their works. Therefore, Scott was following a Scottish tradition when using popular culture in serious works of art. His work displays a profound knowledge of Scottish folk culture. Fusion was further stimulated by the loss of Parliament in 1707. When independence was lost, a national culture, drawing on tradition, could be invented to maintain a unique sense of national identity and counteract the threat of Anglicisation. Thus, the once despised Gaelic culture was gradually transformed in the 18th century into Scottish patriotism by the literati. Although a Tory unionist, Scott saw himself as a defender of Scotland's traditions threatened by liberal Whigs. Interest in folk was not confined to Scotland, however, as classicism was losing favour across Europe, especially in the south and east. Scott respected the rationality of the Enlightenment, but was also questioning, and a counter-enlightenment of irrationality arose. Religion, magic, and the supernatural was used to interpret the cosmos. Scott's awareness of this movement is evidenced by the presence of 18th century Sturm und Drang literature, of which he was an early admirer. He believed that rational centralisation of power in England could threaten Scotland's distinct identity and revive ancient hostilities. Well, plus ça change. So we've come to the end of the talking bit, and I'm now going to finish off with the last few songs. The first of these is from Yorkshire. It's in the minstrelsy, and I don't know who contributed this, but I assume it must have been sung in Scotland. I've never heard it sung in Scotland. In Yorkshire, there is a walk of the same name as this song, and it has dirge in the title, and it is a dirge. It's a funeral dirge, and it tells of what's going to happen when you die. It's the Like Wake dirge. Actually, before I start, I should tell you something. There is a word here, fleet, which is quite deliberate. You see in some translations or versions of it, they use the word sleet. And this error occurred because the F and the S in medieval times were similar, and it didn't appear to make sense to put fleet. It didn't really make any sense to put sleet either, but it happens to be that fire and fleet was a saying similar to what we say hearth and home now. So it very definitely is fleet. And also this is one of those songs where there are matching repeating lines, apart from the first verse, the repeating lines, and the story is carried on A and C. This ain't it, this ain't it, every neat and all, fire and fleet and candle lit, and Christ receive thy soul. When thou from hence away art past, every neat and all, to Winnie-Muir thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. If ever thou gavest hosen and shoon, every neat and all, sit thee down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul. If hosen and shoon thou gavest none, every neat and all, the winnies shall prick thee to the bare bone, and Christ receive thy soul. From Winnie-Muir when thou mayst pass, every neat and all, to Brig o' Dread thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. From Brig o' Dread when thou mayst pass, every neat and all, To purgatory fire thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. If ever thou gavest meat and drink, every need and all, the fire shall never make thee shrink, and Christ receive thy soul. If meat or drink thou gavest name, every need and all, the fire will burn thee to the bare bane, and Christ receive thy soul. This a need, every need and all, fire and fleet and candle each, and Christ receive thy soul, and Christ take up thy soul, which is the Yorkshire that some people sing. Now the next one, we're back in Scotland, and it's another one from the minstrelsy, as was the last. This began as a fragment of a very old ballad, which was drawn on by Mrs. Patrick Coburn of Ormiston, lots and lots of years ago. And then a Miss Jane Elliott expanded on that in the mid-18th century, so it was fairly new when Scott collected it in its current form. And it doesn't change very much. It's written in dialect, which I shall sing because it's pointless doing any other. There are lots of dialect words which wouldn't directly translate anyway. It's the Floo'ers of the forest, and of course it's about the aftermath of the Battle of Flodden. I've heard the Lilton utter your milking, lassies a lilting afore dawn o' day. Now there's a moaning on ilka green loaning, the Floo'ers of the forest are all weed away. At bucks in the morning, nae blithe lads a scorning, lassies a lanely and dowie and way, nae daffing, nae gabbing, but sighing and sobbing. Ilka lifts a leglin and hies her away. In Heshtat the shearing, nae youths are now jeering, bandsters are liars and runcled and grey. At fair or at preaching, nae wooing, nae fleeching, the Floo'ers of the forest are all weed away. Dole for the order, sent to lads to the border, the English forains by guile won the day. The Floo'ers of the forest that fought aye the foremost, the prime of our land lies cold in the clay. We hear name Lilton utter your milking, women and pennies are headless and way, sighing and moaning on ilka green loaning, the Floo'ers of the forest are all weed away. now come to the last song. It's a parting song, funnily enough. And this song was the most popular parting song until Burns wrote Auld Lang Syne. There is a shortened version of this in Scott's minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. It goes under the name of Armstrong's Farewell, although that's not what the song's ever called. Most people seem to think that this is an Irish song, but unless the Irish can come up with something earlier than 1605, it's definitely Scottish, because that's the earliest anyone's found any reference to it. Despite the fact that there are hundreds of Irish who sing it and dozens and dozens who've recorded it, with only a few Scots who've recorded it. But I assume that the man who wrote these two verses, which are in the minstrelsy, was an Armstrong, as that's the name of it. He was, we know, a border reaver, and it was his last letter, his goodbye letter, before he was hanged for his misdeeds on the borders, doing the reaving as they did. And the song has been expanded, and it's called The Parting Glass. Now, the parting glass equates to a stirrup cup, which is the drink that was given to a visitor when they were already mounted on their horse, ready to leave. It was like one for the road. So I'd like to say again, thank you very much for having me. I hope that I've managed to give you some information that you found interesting, and I hope that you've enjoyed my rendition of the songs. So here we are with The Parting Glass. Of all the money that e'er I had, I spent it in good company, and all the harm that e'er I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be to you all. Of all the comrades that e'er I had, they are sorry for my going away. And all the sweethearts that e'er I've had, they would wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls to be my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and softly call. Good night and joy be to you all. A man may drink and not be drunk. A man may fight and not be slain. A man may court a pretty girl and perhaps be welcomed back again. But since it is, as ought to be, a time to rise and a time to fall, come fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be to you. Thank you to Michael, and a big thank you to Lee on sound, because without the sound man we'd have no recording. Good night.